The lantern light trembled in his hand, casting long, dancing shadows against the cavern walls, making the darkness itself seem alive and breathing. Before him, illuminated in the unsteady golden glow, lay a sight that belonged to a forgotten age, a dream of kings and conquistadors. An altar of rough-hewn stone stood at the center of the chamber, laden with treasures that stole the air from his lungs. Gleaming silver chalices, ornate gold crucifixes inlaid with dark jewels, and heavy stacks of colonial coins spilled across the surface, their muted shine a testament to centuries spent in silence. The cool, damp air smelled of deep earth, stone, and something else, something metallic and ancient. Gabriel Tomas Medina, only 11 years old, fell to his knees on the cold ground, the impact jarring his bones. It was not greed that brought him down, but a wave of awe so profound it bordered on terror, the crushing weight of a secret far greater and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. This single moment, born from desperation and betrayal, would redefine the course of his entire existence. It's a story about the promises we are forced to break and the legacies we unearth in the process, a testament to the quiet guardians who protect our history. If you can feel the weight of this discovery settling in your own chest, I'd be honored if you took a moment to let me know where you're listening from in the comments below. Your presence here makes a world of difference, so please consider liking this story and subscribing to our channel. I promise you, Gabriel's journey is one you'll want to follow to its powerful conclusion, a conclusion that proves some treasures are not meant to be spent, but to be understood. But to truly comprehend why a young boy would shatter the most sacred promise ever made to him, defying the dying wish of the only man he had ever loved, we must go back. Our story does not begin here in this chamber of silent gold, but 3 weeks earlier, on a bitterly cold January night in 1931. It begins not with the discovery of a treasure, but with the quiet end of a life. It starts in the small isolated farmhouse where Gabriel's grandfather, Arturo, took his final peaceful breath in his old rocking chair by the hearth, leaving his grandson utterly and completely alone, in a world that was about to turn hostile, armed with nothing but a legacy of love and one terrifying absolute prohibition. For the entirety of his 11 years, Gabriel Tomas Medina's world had been carefully and lovingly constructed within the boundaries of a small, arid farm that seemed to exist outside of time. His universe was composed of the fine reddish dust that coated everything, the vast unending blue of the New Mexico sky, and the constant reassuring presence of his grandfather, Arturo. Gabriel was an orphan in the truest sense of the word, a boy whose life began with an ending. His mother had perished bringing him into the world, and his father, a name without a face, was just another soldier swallowed by the Great War in Europe, a ghost in a uniform he'd never seen. All the love and history a boy was meant to inherit from 2 parents had been concentrated into one man, a man with hands as tough as worn leather and a heart as expansive as the desert itself. Arturo was not just family, he was Gabriel's entire history, his present, and what he believed would be his forever. The bond between them was forged not in grand pronouncements, but in the quiet rituals of their shared existence. Arturo was a teacher of unconventional subjects, his classroom the cracked earth and the star-dusted night. He taught Gabriel how to read the clouds for rain, how to find water where none seemed to exist, and how to understand the silent language of the coyotes that called in the distance. More importantly, he taught Gabriel to read the hearts of men, to see the truth behind their words, and to carry his Mexican heritage not as a burden, but as a badge of unbreakable honor. In his grandfather's presence, Gabriel never felt like an orphan. He felt like the chosen heir to a kingdom of profound, simple wisdom, a world where he was known, seen, and utterly safe from the ambiguities of a world that existed somewhere beyond their property line. Their days were measured by the sun's journey across the sky. They would rise in the cool, pre-dawn gray, the air still holding a whisper of the night's chill, and the scent of brewing coffee would fill their small adobe home. Chores were a shared rhythm, mending fences, tending to the few hardy goats, and working the stubborn soil of their vegetable patch. Meals were simple affairs of beans, tortillas, and whatever they could coax from the land, eaten at a small wooden table while Arturo recounted stories. These were not just routines, they were the scaffolding of Gabriel's life. a predictable and comforting structure that held everything together. He knew the specific creak of the floorboard near the hearth, the weight of the water bucket in his hands, and the exact way the setting sun would cast his grandfather's shadow long across the yard, a giant watching over him until the very end of the day. In the evenings, by the warm, flickering light of a kerosene lamp, the lessons would turn from the practical to the profound. Arturo would speak of their ancestors, the Medinas who had worked this very land for generations, long before it was called New Mexico, when it was a distant and wild frontier of New Spain. He instilled in Gabriel a sense of belonging that was rooted deeper than any fence post, a connection to the soil that was written in his very blood. Gabriel learned that his identity was not defined by what he had lost, but by the long line of resilient people from whom he had come. This land was not just a place to live. It was a living testament to their family's endurance, a legacy of survival and pride that Arturo was carefully placing into his grandson's small, capable hands. Yet, in this world of shared knowledge and open-hearted love, there was one stark, impenetrable secret. In the corner of the kitchen, partially obscured by a heavy, faded curtain, was the basement door. It was made of thick, dark oak, banded with iron, and secured not by one, but by 3 separate, heavy padlocks, each one coated in a layer of rust that spoke of years, perhaps decades, of disuse. This door was the one place where Arturo's gentle guidance was replaced by an unyielding, cold command. It was a silent, ominous presence in their home, a question mark carved into the very foundation of Gabriel's life, a place where all the warmth and trust of their world seemed to stop abruptly, met by an invisible wall of absolute prohibition. Gabriel would never forget the day his grandfather had formalized that prohibition, transforming it from an unspoken rule into a terrifying oath. He had been only 7 at the time, and his curiosity had finally led him to touch one of the cold, rusty locks. Arturo had seen him, and his face, usually a landscape of gentle wrinkles and soft smiles, had hardened into something Gabriel had never seen before. Kneeling down to look his grandson directly in the eye, his voice was low and trembling with an intensity that chilled the boy to his very core. "Listen to me, Gabriel," he had said, his grip firm on the boy's shoulders. "When I am gone, burn the house to the ground if you must, sell the land for a single coin, but you must never, ever go down those stairs." The words hung in the air, not as a warning, but as a curse. From that day forward, the door became a source of quiet dread and consuming fascination. Gabriel's mind, a fertile ground for a child's imagination, populated the darkness below with all manner of horrors. He imagined a monster chained to the wall, a forgotten family madness, or perhaps the ghost of an ancestor too terrible to be spoken of. His love and respect for Arturo were absolute, so he never dared to ask why. He simply accepted it, the way he accepted the rising of the sun and the harshness of the wind. But the unanswered question festered within him, a small pocket of fear and doubt in his otherwise unwavering faith in his grandfather. The door was a constant reminder that there was a part of this man he loved so dearly, a part of his own history, that he was not allowed to know. As the years passed, a new and more tangible fear began to eclipse the mystery of the door. Gabriel started to notice the subtle ways time was eroding his grandfather's strength. A new tremor appeared in Arturo's steady hands when he lifted his coffee cup. His stories, once fluid and endless, now contained longer, more frequent pauses as he searched for a name or a date. A deep weariness had settled into his eyes, a permanent shadow that even his warm smile could no longer fully erase. Gabriel watched these small betrayals of age with a growing, unspoken panic, realizing that the man who was his entire world was slowly, inexorably preparing to leave it. He clung to every moment, trying to memorize the sound of his grandfather's voice, the feel of his hand, trying to hold back a tide that he was utterly powerless to stop. One evening, just a few days before the end, a fierce winter wind rattled the windows of the farmhouse. Inside, the two of them sat by the hearth, the fire casting a warm golden glow on the room. Arturo was reading from an old leather-bound book of Spanish poetry, his voice softer and more raspy than usual, but the passion in his delivery was undiminished. Gabriel wasn't listening to the words as much as he was absorbing the moment, the crackle of the fire, the smell of burning mesquite. and the comforting cadence of his grandfather's voice wrapping around him like a warm blanket. He felt a profound sense of peace, a perfect, fragile moment of love and security, and he wished with all his might that he could freeze time right there, keeping them safe within that circle of firelight forever. Then came the night the fire went out for good. There was no dramatic struggle, no painful goodbye, just an immense and sudden silence. Gabriel woke in the morning to a house that felt unnaturally cold and still. He found Arturo in his old rocking chair by the hearth, a half-empty cup of coffee on the small table beside him, looking as though he had simply drifted off to sleep while watching the embers die down. But his skin was cool to the touch, and the familiar, gentle rise and fall of his chest was gone. He had passed peacefully in the night, leaving his grandson in a world that had, in a single quiet moment, become terrifyingly empty. The silence in the house was no longer peaceful. It was a crushing weight, the sound of absolute loneliness. In the immediate aftermath, Gabriel moved through the house like a ghost, the shock creating a merciful numbness that kept the full force of his grief at bay. The world he had known, the one defined by two people and a few acres of dusty land, had ceased to exist. He was now the sole keeper of the farmhouse, the guardian of his grandfather's memory, and the inheritor of a legacy that felt too heavy to bear. He was completely and utterly alone. As he stood in the kitchen, the first rays of morning light cutting through the window, his eyes were drawn to the faded curtain in the corner. The world outside was vast and unknown, but the greatest mystery, the most immediate and terrifying inheritance, was right there, waiting behind 3 locks and a single unyielding prohibition. The fragile peace of Gabriel's solitary existence lasted for 3 weeks, a period of quiet grief where the world seemed to hold its breath in respect for his loss. The initial shock had receded, leaving behind the dull, persistent ache of loneliness. He performed the daily chores with a mechanical precision, his small body moving through the familiar rhythms his grandfather had taught him, but the joy was gone. The silence in the adobe house was no longer a comforting presence, but a hollow echo, amplifying every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind. It was in this profound stillness that the outside world, a world Arturo had so carefully kept at bay, finally announced its intrusion. It came not with a bang, but with a cloud of dust on the horizon, the telltale sign of an approaching vehicle on the long, unpaved road leading to the farm. The mail carrier's Ford was a rare sight, a noisy, rattling messenger from a civilization that felt a world away. Gabriel watched from the porch as the man, a stranger with a hurried and impersonal air, placed a single crisp envelope into the rusty mailbox at the end of the drive. It was thick and bore the official-looking seal of the Las Cruces Bank. A cold knot formed in Gabriel's stomach as he retrieved it. The letter wasn't addressed to Arturo Medina, but to his memory, to the estate of Arturo Medina. The formal, sterile language felt like a violation, a reduction of his vibrant, loving grandfather to a legal entity. He held the envelope in his hands, the paper feeling unnaturally heavy, as if it contained not just words but the physical weight of a future he was not prepared to face. Back in the quiet kitchen, sitting at the small wooden table where he had shared 1,000 meals with Arturo, Gabriel carefully tore open the seal. His grandfather had taught him to read with patience and care, but the document inside was a labyrinth of dense, unfamiliar terminology. Words like mortgage, arrears, default, and foreclosure swam before his eyes, their meanings obscure, but their tone undeniably menacing. He pushed through the confusing legal jargon until he reached the part that was written in the universal language of numbers, a language that offered no room for misinterpretation. The document stated that an old debt on the farm remained unpaid. The amount owed was $400, a sum so vast it was functionally infinite to him. And then, the final, brutal clause, he had 60 days to produce the money, or the bank would seize the property. The initial confusion curdled into a cold, paralyzing fear. $400. He thought of the small handful of coins he kept in a clay jar on the mantelpiece, earned from selling goat's milk and a few eggs in the village. It was a child's savings, a testament to his small labors, but against this demand, it was less than a single drop of water in the desert. The letter was not a request, it was an ultimatum. A formal, bureaucratic death sentence for the only life he had ever known. The 60-day deadline began to tick in his mind like a bomb. He was no longer just an orphan mourning his grandfather. He was a trespasser on his own land, his time measured out by the cold arithmetic of a bank ledger he had never known existed. The abstract threat of the letter became terrifyingly real 2 days later. Another car, this one sleek, black, and polished to a mirror shine, crawled up the dusty road, looking profoundly out of place against the backdrop of arid land and weathered wood. From the driver's seat emerged a man in a dark, perfectly pressed suit. It was Mr. Raymond Dalton, the manager of the Las Cruces Bank. Gabriel recognized him from town, a man whose presence seemed to suck the warmth from any room he entered, whose smiles were thin, sharp things that never quite reached his cold, assessing eyes. Dalton walked toward the small farmhouse, not with the gait of a visitor, but with the confident stride of an inspector, his gaze sweeping over the property as if he were already measuring it for a new fence. Mr. Dalton did not bother with condolences or pleasantries. He got straight to the point, his voice a smooth, polished instrument of casual cruelty. He held a copy of the letter, tapping it with a manicured finger as he explained the situation in terms a child could not possibly misunderstand. He spoke of the land not as a home, not as a legacy passed down through generations of Medinas, but as collateral, an asset on a balance sheet. He explained the concept of the mortgage with a patronizing simplicity that made Gabriel feel small and ignorant. The entire history of his family, the sweat and sacrifice soaked into that very soil, was reduced to a simple, impersonal business transaction in which he was on the losing end. There was no empathy in the man's eyes, only the predatory glint of opportunity. Then came the offer, delivered with the theatrical magnanimity of a king bestowing a worthless trinket upon a peasant. Mr. Dalton said that, out of the goodness of his heart and his deep respect for Arturo's memory, a lie so blatant it made Gabriel's stomach clench, he was prepared to make a generous offer. He would personally purchase the property, clearing the supposed debt with the bank. He would give Gabriel the sum of $50 for the land his ancestors had bled for, a pittance so insulting it was more of a weapon than a price. He presented this as an act of profound charity, a way to save the boy from the harsh realities of the world, all while the predatory hunger in his eyes betrayed his true intentions. The final turn of the screw came with a smile that was all teeth. As part of his generous offer, Mr. Dalton continued, Gabriel would not be cast out onto the street. He would be permitted to remain on the property. He could live in the small shack behind the main house, the one used for storage, and he would be given a job. He could work the very fields he had always known, tend to the same animals, and maintain the fences his grandfather had built. He would no longer be the heir to the Medina farm. He would be its first hired hand. In that single, devastating moment, Gabriel understood the full scope of Dalton's ambition. This was not about collecting a debt. It was about conquest. It was about erasing a family's history and rewriting it with his own name. Gabriel stood frozen on the porch, his small frame trembling with a mixture of impotent rage and overwhelming despair. Every instinct screamed at him to defy this man, to shout, to throw a rock at his shiny car, to defend his home with the fierce pride Arturo had instilled in him. But he was 11 years old with no family, no money, and no legal power. He was a child facing a corrupt and powerful system, embodied by the man standing before him. The law, which was supposed to protect people, was being wielded as a weapon to dispossess him. He felt the crushing weight of his own powerlessness, a suffocating realization that there was no one to turn to, no one to fight for him. He was utterly, completely alone against a monster in a suit. Mr. Dalton, seeing the boy's silent, broken submission, gave a curt nod, satisfied that his message had been delivered. He turned and walked back to his car without another word. The business concluded. The black automobile drove away, leaving a plume of red dust to settle back onto the land it had come to claim. The air, once again still, felt different now. It was charged with a new and terrible silence, the silence of a countdown. The 60-day deadline was no longer an abstract threat on a piece of paper. It was a ticking clock, each second bringing him closer to the moment when he would lose everything: his home, his heritage, and the last physical connection to the man who had been his entire world. The farm was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a prison with an eviction date. For days after Mr. Dalton's visit, the farmhouse ceased to be a home and became a cage whose bars were forged from silence and time. The 60-day deadline was no longer an abstract date on a piece of paper. It was a living, breathing entity that haunted every corner of the small adobe house. Gabriel moved through his chores in a fog of dread, the familiar landscape of his life now feeling alien and hostile. Every rock and every crooked fence post seemed to mock him, silent witnesses to a legacy he was about to lose. He thought of seeking help, of walking to the village and speaking to the old priest or their neighbors, but the thought died before it could form a plan. What could they do? They were people of the earth, as poor and as powerless as he was. Dalton was a man of documents and laws, a predator from a world they could not fight. The crushing realization settled in his bones. There was no help coming. The nights were the worst. Sleep offered no escape, only a shallow refuge from which he would wake with a jolt, his heart pounding in the darkness. The steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had once been a comforting heartbeat in the quiet house, now became a torment. Each tick was a second lost, a step closer to the day he would be cast out. He would lie in his small bed, staring into the oppressive blackness. Replaying Mr. Dalton's words, the man's thin, predatory smile burned into his memory. The offer to let him stay as a hired hand was the cruelest part, a calculated humiliation designed to strip him not just of his land, but of his dignity. The shame of it was a hot, bitter taste in his mouth, a poison that fueled a growing, impotent rage against a world that had suddenly become unjust. The breaking point arrived without ceremony, on an evening a week later. He was standing in the kitchen, the last light of day painting the room in mournful shades of orange and grey. He had just finished a meager meal of beans and a stale tortilla, and the gnawing emptiness in his stomach was a stark reflection of the emptiness of his future. It was in that moment of profound and absolute hopelessness that his gaze drifted to the corner of the room, to the heavy, faded curtain. Behind it lay the one part of his world that remained an unknown, a place his grandfather had sealed off with a terrifying finality. For the first time, the door did not represent a childhood fear of monsters or ghosts. It represented a variable, a single unread page in a story that was otherwise finished. It was the only place left in his world where a solution, however improbable or terrible, might be hidden. The internal battle was immediate and violent. His grandfather's voice, etched into his very soul, rose up in protest. Never go down those stairs. The promise he had made as a small boy was not just a collection of words. It was a pillar of his love for Arturo, a sacred trust he had never once considered breaking. To defy that final, solemn command felt like a desecration, a betrayal of the one person who had ever loved him. He squeezed his eyes shut, his small hands clenched into fists, as the memory of his grandfather's stern face warred with the image of Dalton's triumphant smirk. He was trapped between two impossible choices: honor the dead and lose everything they had ever built, or betray his only family for the slimmest chance of survival. The guilt was a physical weight, threatening to crush him, but the cold, sharp edge of desperation was stronger. Slowly, a new, heartbreaking clarity began to form amidst the turmoil of his thoughts. His grandfather had taught him to be strong, to be resilient, to read the land and survive its harshness. Arturo had prepared him for everything except this, for a fight against men who used paper and ink as weapons. Perhaps, Gabriel reasoned, this was the final, unspoken test. The decision solidified not as an act of rebellion, but as one of sorrowful necessity. He would break his promise not because he loved his grandfather any less, but because it was the only way to honor the life Arturo had given him. He would face whatever horror lay behind that door, because the horror of losing his home, his history, and his very identity was a far more certain and immediate threat. He had to know what his grandfather had been so desperate to protect. The plan was not a plan at all, but a single, focused objective. He waited until the 30th day before the foreclosure, a grim milestone that marked the halfway point to his eviction. As dusk settled over the desert, he walked out to the barn, the air cool and still. The familiar scent of hay, dust, and old leather filled his lungs. He ran his hand over the worn, smooth handle of his grandfather's wood-splitting mallet, a tool he had watched the old man swing 1,000 times. In that simple touch, there was a silent goodbye, not to his grandfather's memory, but to the innocent boy who had lived under his protection. He then selected the heavy mallet and a long, thick steel chisel from the tool wall. Their combined weight was substantial in his small hands, a cold, metallic burden that felt like the physical manifestation of the promise he was about to break. This was the point of no return. He walked back to the house, each step heavy and deliberate. The tools felt unnaturally cold against his skin. Inside, the kitchen was dark except for the single kerosene lamp he had lit on the table, its golden light casting long, dancing shadows that made the room feel unfamiliar and menacing. He pulled back the faded curtain, exposing the 3 padlocks. They gleamed dully in the lamplight, 3 silent sentinels guarding a forgotten secret. For a long moment, he simply stood there, his heart hammering against his ribs, the sound of his own ragged breathing filling the immense silence of the house. He felt a tremor of his old childhood fear, a primal instinct screaming at him to turn back, to leave the secret buried. He was about to commit the single greatest transgression of his young life, an act of unforgivable disobedience. Then, as he stared at the cold iron of the locks, a different memory of his grandfather surfaced, pushing through the fear and guilt. He saw Arturo not as the stern guardian of a dark secret, but as the man who would sit with him on the porch, pointing out the constellations in the vast, star-dusted sky, his voice filled with wonder and warmth. He remembered the feeling of safety, of unconditional love. That memory, a pure and powerful flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness of his despair, did not erase the guilt, but it gave him the strength to endure it. He raised the chisel, its steel tip finding the rusted shackle of the first lock. He took one last, shuddering breath, a boy on the precipice of a choice that would irrevocably alter the course of his entire existence. The final deafening crack of shattering iron echoed through the silent farmhouse, a sound of violation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the old adobe walls. For a moment, Gabriel stood frozen, the heavy mallet hanging limp in his hand, the gravity of his transgression settling upon him like a physical shroud. Guilt and a terrifying, exhilarating fear warred within his chest. With a grunt of effort, he pulled the heavy oak door toward him. It groaned in protest, its ancient hinges scraping against rusted pins, finally swinging open to release a gust of cool, musty air that smelled of deep earth and forgotten time. This was it. The point of no return. The promise was broken, and whatever lay in the darkness below was now his burden to bear alone, a consequence he had chosen over the slow, certain death of his world above. He lifted the kerosene lantern, its light cutting a weak, trembling circle into the oppressive blackness of the stairwell. He took the first step down onto the cold stone. Each subsequent step felt heavier than the last, a deliberate descent not just into a cellar, but into a place of profound disobedience. The air grew colder, damper, clinging to his skin and chilling him more deeply than the winter night ever could. The sound of his own ragged breathing was unnaturally loud in his ears, a frantic rhythm against the immense silence of the earth. He felt the full weight of his grandfather's prohibition on his small shoulders, a spectral hand trying to pull him back up into the light, but he forced himself to continue downward, one treacherous step at a time. He finally reached the bottom, his boots landing softly on a floor of packed dirt. The cellar was small, cramped and utterly unremarkable. Old canning jars lined dusty shelves, their contents long since turned to murky shadows. Broken tools and pieces of old furniture lay in a forgotten heap in one corner, draped in cobwebs as thick as cotton. A wave of bitter disappointment washed over him, so sharp it almost brought him to his knees. Was this it? Was this the great, terrible secret, just a dusty, forgotten storage room? The desperate hope that had fueled his transgression began to flicker and die, replaced by the cold, hollow certainty of his failure and the shame of his pointless betrayal. His hope, however, was not entirely extinguished. As the lantern's light swept across the small room, it caught on something unusual behind a tall stack of old wooden crates in the far corner. It was a draught, a subtle but steady movement of air where none should exist. His grandfather had never been a messy or careless man. Everything on the farm had its purpose and its place. The crates were stacked too neatly, too deliberately, forming a solid wall that didn't quite meet the rough stone of the foundation. A tiny, almost imperceptible sliver of darkness showed between the wood and the stone. A flicker of his dying hope reignited, a tiny spark in the crushing disappointment. He set the lantern down on a nearby barrel, its steady glow creating long, monstrous shadows that danced on the walls around him. He put his shoulder to the first crate and pushed. It was heavy, filled with something solid and unyielding that shifted with a dull thud inside. He strained against its weight, his muscles burning, his worn boots slipping on the dusty floor. For a frustrating moment it felt impossible, another dead end designed to mock his efforts. Then he thought of Mr. Dalton's thin, predatory smile, and a surge of desperate, angry strength flowed through him. He set his feet, took a deep breath and shoved again. The crate groaned, its wooden base scraping loudly against the stone. One by one, he wrestled the heavy crates away from the wall. It was exhausting, punishing work for an 11-year-old boy. His breath came in ragged, painful gasps, and the air grew thick with disturbed dust that choked him and made his eyes water. His hands were soon raw and pricked with splinters from the rough wood. But with each crate he managed to move, the cold draft grew stronger, a focused stream of ancient air flowing from the foundation. Finally he heaved the last one aside, and the lantern light revealed the truth. It was not a wall. It was an opening, a dark, narrow archway carved directly into the bedrock, an entrance to a place that had no right to exist. He stood before the tunnel, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, the sound so loud in the silence he feared it might cause a cave-in. This was the real secret, the true reason for the locks and the solemn oath. The cellar was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie, a mundane disguise for something ancient and profound. The darkness inside the passage was absolute, a solid, physical blackness that seemed to actively consume the lantern's light at its edge. A primal fear, the kind from his most terrifying childhood nightmares, gripped him with icy fingers. The urge to run, to slam the basement door shut, replace the crates and pretend he had never seen this, was a powerful screaming instinct. His grandfather's warning was no longer a memory. It was a living presence in the cold air, begging him to turn back. But what would he be turning back to? A house that was no longer his? A future as a hired hand on his own ancestral land? The image of his grandfather's kind, weathered face was suddenly and violently replaced by the cold, calculating eyes of Mr. Dalton. The choice, as terrible as it was, became brutally clear. He had already committed the betrayal. To stop now would render his sacrifice, his guilt, completely meaningless. He took a single, shuddering breath that felt like drawing fire into his lungs, picked up the lantern, and forced himself to take the first step into the tunnel, leaving the familiar, dying world of the farmhouse behind for whatever lay ahead in the deep dark. The passage was tight, the rough-hewn rock walls close enough to brush against his shoulders on either side. The air was stale and heavy, carrying the deep, clean scent of damp earth and cold stone. The ground sloped gently but steadily downward, and he had to watch his footing carefully on the uneven, debris-strewn surface. His only connection to the world he knew was the small, wavering circle of golden light cast by the lantern. He glanced back once, seeing the entrance to the cellar shrink to a small, pale rectangle before the tunnel curved, and it disappeared completely. He was now plunged into a profound, suffocating darkness, a world defined only by what his small flame could reveal. He walked for what felt like an eternity, measuring his progress by his own footsteps. The only sound was the soft scuff of his worn boots on the rock and the frantic, echoing thumping of his own heart. Time seemed to lose its meaning in the featureless dark. 50 meters. He would later guess, but in that terrifying moment it could have been a mile. He was completely and utterly disoriented, a tiny, fragile boy moving through the deep belly of the earth, guided by a single, flickering flame. He felt an immense sense of being alone, more alone than he had ever felt in the silent, empty house above, a solitary explorer in a world no one was meant to see. Suddenly, without any warning, the lantern sputtered violently. The bright yellow flame shrank to a tiny, hesitant blue bead, threatening to extinguish and leave him stranded in an absolute, impenetrable blackness. Panic, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, seized him. He froze in place, holding his breath, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the lantern's wire handle. He was terrified to move, terrified to even breathe. He gave the lantern a gentle, desperate shake, praying to a god he wasn't sure was listening. The flame flickered, caught on the wick, and then with a soft whoosh, it flared back to its steady, golden glow. The relief that flooded him was so intense it left him weak, and he had to lean against the cold rock wall, his entire body trembling. He pushed onward, his pace now more urgent, a new fear driving him forward, the fear that the light would not last. The air began to change again, becoming less stagnant. A new scent reached him, faint at first, then stronger, something metallic and ancient, like the smell of old coins left in a drawer for a century. The tunnel widened slightly, and he felt a subtle shift in the acoustics of the space. His footsteps no longer sounded so muffled and close. They began to produce a faint echo that hinted at a larger chamber ahead. He raised the lantern higher, and its light seemed to stretch forward, catching on something in the distance. It was not a solid wall of rock, but the end of the tunnel. It opened into a larger space, and he could see a faint, almost imperceptible glimmer of light from somewhere beyond his own. A new energy surged through him, a powerful mixture of profound fear and an electrifying, unbearable anticipation. He quickened his pace, half walking, half stumbling over the uneven ground in his haste. The opening grew larger with every step, the strange metallic scent becoming stronger, more pronounced. The narrow confines of the tunnel finally fell away, and he stepped out into a vast natural chamber, a cavern far larger than he could have possibly imagined. His small lantern was no longer the only source of light. Thin, dusty shafts of moonlight filtered down from unseen cracks high in the cavern's ceiling, illuminating a scene that belonged to a forgotten age, a dream of kings and conquistadors. And it was here, stepping out of the claustrophobic passage and into the breathtaking cavern, that his desperate journey reached its conclusion and his true discovery began. Before him, illuminated in the unsteady golden glow of his lantern and the ethereal silver of the moonlight, stood an altar of rough-hewn stone at the center of the room, laden with the impossible muted gleam of silver and gold. The sight was so overwhelming, so far beyond the scope of his wildest imagination, that the last of his strength drained from his legs. It was here that he fell to his knees on the cold ground, the impact jarring his bones, not from greed but from the crushing, terrifying weight of a secret his grandfather had died to protect. The cavern opened before him not as a room, but as a separate secret world carved into the belly of the earth. The air that washed over him was profoundly different from the stale, confined atmosphere of the tunnel. It was cool, alive, and carried the clean, deep scent of damp stone and ancient, undisturbed dust. High above, in a ceiling so vast and dark it seemed like a subterranean night sky, a few thin fissures allowed slivers of pale moonlight to pierce the blackness. These ethereal beams cut through the gloom like silver swords, illuminating floating motes of dust and painting the chamber in a ghostly, shifting light. After the claustrophobic darkness of the passage, the sheer scale of the space was dizzying, a silent, hollow immensity that stole the air from his lungs and made him feel infinitesimally small, a trespasser in a place that had slept for centuries. He took a tentative step forward, his worn boot making no sound on the soft, packed earth floor, as if the cavern itself were holding its breath. His own small lantern, held aloft in a trembling hand, added a warm, golden counterpoint to the moon's cold silver. Its flickering glow pushed back the edges of the oppressive shadows, revealing the true nature of the chamber. It was a natural formation, a great bubble in the bedrock, its walls sweeping upwards in rugged, organic curves, glistening with beads of moisture that caught the light like scattered diamonds. The silence here was a physical presence, a pressure against his eardrums, deeper and more absolute than any quiet he had ever known in the farmhouse above. It was the silence of forgotten time, a quiet so profound that the sound of his own frantic, shallow breathing seemed a vulgar intrusion, a desecration of the chamber's sacred stillness. He felt an overwhelming urge to be silent, to cease even the beat of his own heart, to become as still and as timeless as the stone around him. As his eyes slowly adjusted, they were drawn irresistibly toward the center of the cavern, to the one object that was clearly not a part of the natural landscape. There, situated directly beneath the largest of the moonbeams, stood an altar. It was not ornate or polished, but a block of rough-hewn stone, massive and solid, that looked as though it had been wrestled from the earth and given purpose by human hands ages ago. Its presence was a stark declaration of intent in the wild, untamed space, a focal point that anchored the entire chamber and gave it a sense of solemn, unspoken significance. It was a place of ceremony, of offering, of secrets kept. Gabriel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cavern's temperature. He was standing on ground that was not just hidden, but hallowed. Upon the altar, arranged with a deliberate, almost ceremonial care, lay a treasure that belonged to a forgotten age, a dream of kings and conquistadors. The combined light of the moon and his lantern fell upon the muted shine of tarnished silver and the deep, buttery glow of old gold. Heavy, ornate chalices, their surfaces chased with intricate patterns now softened by time, stood beside weighty crucifixes inlaid with dark, unblinking jewels that seemed to drink the light. Spilling between them in chaotic, glittering piles were stacks of colonial coins, their stamped faces worn smooth by centuries of silent waiting. It was not a pirate's hoard, thrown together in haste, but a collection that felt curated, protected, each piece placed with a reverence that spoke of its profound importance. The sheer, impossible reality of it was a physical blow, a sight so far beyond the realm of his imagination that his mind struggled to accept what his eyes were seeing. This was not the simple, desperate solution he had prayed for. In his most frantic moments, he had imagined finding a small box of his grandfather's savings, a handful of coins to appease the bank and save his home. This, however, was something else entirely. It was not a solution, it was a cataclysm. The sight before him was not one of relief, but of a terrifying, crushing weight. This was the secret his grandfather had carried, the burden that had necessitated the locks, the oath, and the impenetrable silence. He could feel the history radiating from the objects on the altar, the weight of the lives and the faith they represented. A profound awe, so immense it bordered on a holy terror, washed over him, weakening his limbs and clouding his vision. He understood in that instant that he had not just broken a promise. He had unearthed a history far greater and more dangerous than he could ever have conceived. And it was then, in that moment of overwhelming realization, that his body finally surrendered to the impossible weight of his discovery. His knees buckled, no longer able to support him, and he collapsed onto the cold, damp earth of the cavern floor. The impact was a dull, jarring thud that echoed softly in the immense space, the only sound in a world that had gone completely silent. The lantern, still clutched in his hand, trembled violently, its light dancing and skittering across the stone walls and the gleaming treasure, making the shadows themselves seem to writhe and recoil. He was on his knees, not in an act of prayer or greed, but in an involuntary act of submission to the sheer, crushing magnitude of the secret he had just laid bare. The boy who had descended the stairs was gone, and in his place was a guardian, though he did not yet know it. From this new, lower perspective, the altar seemed to loom over him like a judge's bench. The piles of gold and silver were no longer just beautiful objects. They were a silent, glittering congregation of witnesses to his transgression. The dancing shadows cast by his unsteady flame gave the chamber a terrifying, living quality, as if the ghosts of those who had hidden this treasure here were stirring in the darkness, their silent condemnation filling the air. He felt their presence, the weight of their sacrifice and their long vigil. He was an intruder, a boy who had used a hammer and chisel to break his way into a sacred trust. The terror that gripped him now was not of monsters or of the dark, but of the profound responsibility that had just fallen upon his small, unworthy shoulders. His mind, reeling from the shock, frantically tried to reassemble his world. He thought of his grandfather, Arturo, and for the first time, he saw the old man's prohibition not as an act of concealment, but as an act of profound protection. Arturo had not been trying to keep Gabriel out. He had been trying to shield him from this very moment, from this unbearable weight. The guilt of his betrayal was now hopelessly entangled with a dawning, heartbreaking understanding. His grandfather's stern face, the one that had delivered the solemn oath, was now superimposed with an image of a man stooped by the invisible weight of this cavern, a man who had walked through his life carrying this secret alone. The love behind the command was now terrifyingly, beautifully clear. As his ragged breathing began to steady, his gaze shifted from the glittering metal to something else resting on the altar, something he had overlooked in his initial shock. Set apart from the treasure, placed carefully on a piece of faded velvet, was a collection of documents. They were rolled into tight scrolls and bound with leather cords, their ends sealed with dark, brittle wax that bore the impression of an unfamiliar crest. Unlike the gold and silver, they held no intrinsic monetary value, yet they were positioned with a prominence that suggested they were the most important items in the entire chamber. They were not just stored here, they were being presented, preserved with a level of care that spoke of a value far greater than any precious metal. A new kind of curiosity, sharper and more urgent than his initial awe, began to cut through his fear. He remained on his knees, the cold from the ground seeping through the thin fabric of his trousers. The $400 he needed to save the farm, a sum that had been the absolute center of his universe just an hour ago, now felt like a triviality, a meaningless number from a different, smaller world. The treasure before him could pay that debt 100 times over, but a deep, instinctual knowledge settled in his gut. Not a single coin was his to spend. To touch it for his own gain would be a greater violation than breaking the locks. This was not a windfall, it was a testament. The weight of his own problems seemed to shrink in the face of this immense historical burden. He had come down here searching for a way to save his future, and instead, he had found a past that threatened to consume him entirely. The initial violent storm of emotion, the fear, the awe, the guilt, began to subside, leaving behind a profound and unnerving stillness. He was just a boy, an orphan, kneeling in the dark heart of the earth, surrounded by the lost patrimony of a forgotten world. In that moment, he felt the spectral presence of his grandfather, more strongly than he had since the old man's passing. It was not a scolding or a comforting presence, but one of silent, solemn communion. He felt the long, unbroken line of his lineage, the generations of Medinas who had lived and died on the land above, and he understood that he was now a part of their story in a way he had never been before. The secret was now his. He had descended into the darkness seeking salvation and had found a legacy instead, a sacred duty passed on in silence and shadow. With the cold, hard weight of the rolled parchment in his coat pocket, Gabriel began the 10-mile journey to the San Miguel mission. He did not run. He walked with a slow, deliberate pace, as if the immense gravity of the cavern had followed him out into the world. The pre-dawn air was sharp and thin, biting at his exposed cheeks, but he barely felt the cold. His mind was a maelstrom of conflicting images, the impossible gleam of gold, the stern set of his grandfather's jaw, the predatory smile of Mr. Dalton. He had left the treasure untouched, a silent, glittering testament to a history he could not comprehend, taking only this single sealed document. His grandfather had spoken of Padre Ignacio Sandoval only a few times, but always with a tone of deep, unshakable respect, referring to him as a man who understood the old ways, a man of true faith. In a world where every other door had closed, the church was his last, desperate hope. The walk was a pilgrimage through his own life. He passed the familiar landmarks of his small world, the twisted mesquite tree that marked the halfway point to the village, the dry arroyo where he and Arturo had once tracked a coyote for hours. Each one was a painful reminder of a life that was about to be erased. He clutched the document in his pocket, its crisp edges a tangible link to the terrifying secret below his home. He wasn't sure what he expected the priest to do. He had no clear plan, only a deep, instinctual feeling, a whisper from his grandfather's own wisdom that this was the right and only path. He was a boy carrying a single unread page of a 250-year-old story, walking toward the only man left who might know how to read it. The sun was just beginning to cast a pale, watery light over the eastern mountains when the simple, whitewashed walls of the mission came into view. He found Padre Ignacio in the mission's small, quiet library, a room that smelled of old paper, beeswax, and dry incense. The priest was an elderly man, his face a kind, compassionate map of deep wrinkles, his eyes holding a gentle, weary wisdom. He looked up from a heavy, leather-bound book as Gabriel entered, his expression shifting from surprise to a sad, knowing recognition. He knew who the boy was. He had known Arturo. Gabriel, his throat tight with a mixture of fear and exhaustion, did not speak at first. He simply reached into his pocket and placed the sealed document on the polished surface of the old wooden desk that stood between them. The silence in the room was thick with unspoken history as the priest's gaze fell upon the scroll. Padre Ignacio reached out a trembling, age-spotted hand and gently touched the brittle, dark wax seal. His eyes, magnified slightly by his spectacles, widened in a flash of profound sorrow and understanding. He traced the unfamiliar crest with the tip of his finger, a crest Gabriel had not recognized, but which the priest clearly did. "Arturo," he whispered, the name a soft, mournful exhalation. "So, the burden has passed to you, my boy." The priest's words were not a question, but a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of a legacy Gabriel was only just beginning to perceive. In that moment, Gabriel knew he had come to the right place. The priest saw not a trespassing boy, but the inheritor of a sacred and heavy trust. With the utmost care, Padre Ignacio broke the ancient seal, the dry wax crumbling to dust under his practiced fingers. He unrolled the parchment, its surface covered in the elegant, faded script of a forgotten era. For a long moment he read in silence, his expression a mixture of reverence and sorrow. Then he looked up at Gabriel, his eyes filled with a story that was far larger than a single boy or a single farm. He began to speak, his voice low and steady, and with his words, he began to rebuild Gabriel's entire world from its very foundations. He explained that the treasure in the cavern was not a private fortune, but the hidden patrimony of a Franciscan mission, a collection of sacred objects concealed in the desperate, violent days of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 to save them from destruction and plunder. The priest's words painted a picture of a secret, kept through the blood and fire of history. He told Gabriel that for 2.5 centuries, the location of the chamber and the duty of its protection had been passed down through a sworn line of guardians. 7 local families, including the Medinas, had been entrusted with this sacred obligation, a silent, solemn promise that bound them to the land and to each other. Generation after generation, they had kept the secret, living and dying on the land above, their lives a quiet, unassuming shield for the history that slept below. The weight of this revelation was immense. His ancestors were not just farmers, they were sentinels, keepers of a sacred trust. And then the priest delivered the final, shattering truth. Of the 7 families, only the Medina line had endured. Arturo, he explained, had been the last living guardian. Gabriel's mind reeled, and suddenly his grandfather's entire life was cast in a new, heroic light. The secrecy, the prohibition, the 3 locks on the door, it was not born of fear or shame, but of an unbreakable honor. It was the crushing weight of a 250-year-old oath that had hardened his grandfather's face that day, the burden of being the final link in a sacred chain. He had not been trying to keep Gabriel from a secret. He had been trying to protect him from a responsibility that had consumed his own life in silence. Padre Ignacio then gestured to the document spread open on the desk, its elegant script a testament to its age. This, he explained, was not a map, a will, or a deed to the treasure. It was something infinitely more powerful. It was the original Spanish royal land grant issued by the Crown in the year 1695. It bestowed the land, the entire tract that included the Medina farm and the surrounding properties, to Gabriel's ancestors and their descendants in perpetuity. It was a foundational document, an ownership claim that predated not only the bank in Las Cruces, but the founding of the United States of America itself. It was a piece of paper that held the legal and spiritual soul of his people. The implication of this fact settled over Gabriel with the force of a physical blow. The mortgage, the foreclosure notice, Mr. Dalton's smug, predatory offer. It was all a lie, a fraud. The bank had no legal claim to his land, and it never had. He was not a powerless orphan on the verge of eviction. He was the rightful heir to a legacy protected by the authority of a king from a bygone era. Mr. Dalton had not discovered a loophole. He had constructed a fiction, a weapon of paper and ink designed to steal what he could never rightfully own. The feeling that washed over Gabriel was not one of triumph, but of a profound, earth-shaking vindication that resonated through generations of his family's history. Padre Ignacio, seeing the storm of understanding in the boy's eyes, continued in a softer voice. He explained that he and Arturo had been friends since they were boys, and that he had known about the guardianship, though not the exact location of the chamber. Arturo had carried his burden with a quiet dignity, never speaking of it, but the weight was always there, a shadow behind his kind eyes. The priest confessed that Arturo's greatest fear was not that the treasure would be found, but that this document, the true shield of his people, would be lost, and that the history it protected would be erased by men like Dalton, men who saw land not as a legacy, but as a commodity to be bought and sold. An investigation, the priest promised, would begin immediately. This document was not just a defense, it was a sword. It would not only save Gabriel's farm, but it would expose the rot at the heart of Dalton's dealings. He spoke of other families in the region, other Mexican-American landowners who had been mysteriously forced from their ancestral homes by the bank's relentless pressure. Suddenly, Gabriel's personal struggle was part of a much larger story of injustice. His grandfather hadn't just been protecting a family secret, he had been guarding the last defense for an entire community, a key to unlocking them from the predatory grip of a corrupt system. In the quiet of the library, surrounded by the scent of old paper and the weight of history, Gabriel finally understood the full measure of his grandfather's love. It was a love so profound that Arturo had been willing to be misunderstood, to be seen as a stern keeper of a dark secret, in order to shield his grandson from this fight for as long as possible. The prohibition was not a wall between them. It was a shield Arturo had held up against the world. Every stern word, every locked door, had been an act of fierce, silent protection. He had been guarding not just gold and silver, but Gabriel's right to exist, his connection to the land, his very name. The strength that had carried Gabriel through the 10-mile walk, through the breaking of the locks, and through the terrifying descent into the earth, finally gave way. The rigid control he had maintained for weeks shattered, and a deep, shuddering sob broke from his chest. The tears that streamed down his face were not tears of grief for the man he had lost, but tears of overwhelming, heartbreaking gratitude for the man he had just in that moment truly found. He was not crying because he was alone. He was crying because he finally understood with absolute certainty that he had never been alone at all. He had been loved, protected, and guarded by a quiet hero. He reached out a trembling hand and laid it flat on the ancient parchment, feeling the textured paper beneath his small, dirt-stained fingers. He could almost feel the echoes of the past, the long line of guardians stretching back through time, a chain of honor and sacrifice that had led to this very moment in this room. He felt his grandfather's presence beside him, not as a memory, but as a living legacy, a silent approval for the promise that had been broken so that a greater one could be kept. The guilt that had tormented him was washed away, replaced by a profound and humbling sense of purpose. The priest allowed him to cry, a gentle, patient hand resting on his shoulder, offering a silent comfort that transcended words. The sob subsided into a quiet, exhausted peace. Gabriel looked up at Padre Ignacio, his eyes red-rimmed but clear for the first time in weeks. The fear was gone. The desperation was gone. In their place was a new and unfamiliar resolve, a strength that was not his own, but was borrowed from the generations of Medinas who had stood watch before him. He was no longer just Gabriel Tomas Medina, the orphan. He was the keeper of a sacred trust, the guardian of his people's soul. He thought of the treasure, sitting in the silent darkness beneath his home. He understood now why his grandfather had never touched a single coin. Its value was not in its gold, but in its story. It was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the faith of those who had hidden it, and a sacred inheritance that could not be spent. To use it to pay Dalton's fraudulent debt would have been the ultimate desecration. His grandfather had chosen to live a life of humble poverty rather than betray the trust he had been given. It was the final, most powerful lesson Arturo had ever taught him. a lesson delivered in silence across the veil of death itself. The ensuing investigation was swift and decisive. Armed with the irrefutable evidence of the royal land grant, Padre Ignacio brought the matter before the authorities, bypassing the corrupt local channels and going straight to the state. The document was an historical and legal bombshell, and its authenticity was quickly verified. Mr. Dalton's carefully constructed empire of deceit crumbled under the weight of a 250-year-old piece of paper. The foreclosure notice on the Medina farm was immediately nullified, exposed as the brazen fraud it was. But the story did not end there. The investigation widened, uncovering a systematic conspiracy of forged documents and predatory loans that Dalton had used to dispossess 11 other Mexican-American families of their ancestral lands. The scandal that erupted in Las Cruces was a firestorm of public outrage and long overdue justice. Mr. Dalton was arrested, his reputation ruined, his predatory reign brought to an ignominious end. The 3,000 acres of stolen land were restored to their rightful owners, families who had believed their heritage was lost forever. In the end, Gabriel's desperate act of breaking a promise had not only saved his own home, it had become the catalyst for the liberation of an entire community. The name Medina, once associated with a quiet, reclusive old man, became a symbol of resilience and the enduring power of history against modern greed. The quiet guardianship of his ancestors had yielded its final, most important fruit. A short time later, a bishop from Santa Fe, having heard the incredible story, made a personal visit to the small adobe farmhouse. He walked with Gabriel and Padre Ignacio through the house, his eyes lingering on the now unlocked basement door. Moved by the boy's profound integrity, a child who, upon discovering a fortune, had sought counsel instead of cashing in, the bishop made a declaration. The sacred patrimony would remain where it had been kept safe for centuries, in the deep, silent darkness of the earth. The secret would be kept, but the guardianship would continue. A new sentinel was needed to take up the watch that Arturo Medina had laid down. And so Gabriel Tomas Medina, the boy who had been an orphan, found a family. He was formally adopted by Padre Ignacio and his kind, widowed sister Doña Esperanza, who came to live with them at the farm. The house, once filled with a crushing silence, was now filled with the warmth of quiet conversation, the smell of fresh tortillas, and the gentle rhythm of a life restored. The Medina farm remained in his care, his future secure, his connection to the land unbroken. He was no longer a boy adrift in a hostile world, but a young man anchored by a profound sense of place and purpose, a purpose that lay waiting behind a simple door in his kitchen. Gabriel never spent a single coin of the treasure. He grew up strong and thoughtful, his character forged in the crucible of loss and discovery. He became a local history teacher, a man who understood that the true wealth of his community lay not in gold, but in the stories and the legacies of its people. He married a woman from the village at the age of 26 and raised 3 children in the same small adobe farmhouse, teaching them to read the land and the stars, just as his grandfather had taught him. The treasure in the cavern became the silent foundational secret of their family, a source not of wealth, but of identity. Only when each of his children turned 11, the same age he had been when he faced the locks, did he take them down the stone steps, through the long dark tunnel, and into the moonlit cavern. There, before the altar, laden with the silent, glittering history of their people, he would tell them the story. He would speak of the guardians, of the Pueblo revolt, of their great-grandfather Arturo's solemn duty, and of the corrupt banker who nearly erased it all. And then he would ask each of them to make a promise, the very same promise his grandfather had asked of him, transforming what was once a terrifying burden of secrecy into a sacred and shared legacy of trust, honor, and the quiet, unbreakable guardianship of a history that was, and always would be, far more valuable than gold.